Betting markets currently assign roughly a 10% chance that the United States would invade Greenland, a probability that seems excessively high both from the perspective of 2026 and even more so from 2024. Yet, setting aside all rational considerations, let's entertain the hypothetical scenario of the Trump administration launching an invasion of Greenland. Exploring this scenario sheds light on the nature of democratic transparency, the intricacies of Western economic interdependence, and the broader security dynamics in the Arctic region. It is better to deliberate such possibilities now rather than be blindsided by a real event later. As I navigate this scenario, envision Trump at the helm of the invading forces, but keep in mind another figure who might be relevant to this thought experiment. If the United States were to invade Greenland, the operation would be surprisingly straightforward. Imagine assembling a couple of carrier strike groups, supplemented with submarines for protection, and setting sail directly for Greenland. Once there, the United States could simply declare sovereignty over the territory. Greenland is roughly the size of Saudi Arabia, but has a sparse population of fewer than 57,000 people. Denmark, responsible for Greenland's defense, possesses limited military assets. Its naval squadron includes 4 frigates, 3 patrol ships, and a royal yacht. These forces would be rapidly overwhelmed in any naval engagement. One might wonder how the American petty officer who captured a famous photo during such an operation would feel about the unfolding situation. On land, Denmark's defensive capabilities in Greenland are minimal. The Joint Arctic Command maintains a few facilities staffed by hundreds of personnel, but these forces are insufficient to mount a significant defense. The capital, Nuuk, is the only major population center and poses an interesting challenge. The occupying forces might choose to largely ignore it, since controlling the city might not be necessary to assert dominance over the island, and because subjugating the population is not the point of acquiring Greenland. Alternatively, the occupiers could offer economic incentives to placate the local population, hoping to secure compliance, if not full support. Perhaps Greenlanders might even adopt slogans like "Make America Great Again" instead of their usual chants. The aftermath raises deeper questions. Greenland is extremely remote, so physical resistance or protests would be scattered and muted due to the vast empty spaces. Managing such an expansive, sparsely inhabited territory would resemble science fiction scenarios of military engagements on the moon, except Greenland's conditions are far colder. Given Greenland's current defensive posture, a military takeover would not be the difficult part. The real challenge lies in avoiding the complete unraveling of the United States internally as a consequence. This challenge unfolds across 5 key issues: leaks, trade warfare, fiscal warfare, besieged military bases, and a constitutional crisis. Keep in mind the earlier hint about another figure as we explore these points. First, it is nearly impossible to imagine such a large-scale military operation occurring without extensive leaks beforehand. Moving massive amounts of naval hardware and thousands of personnel would involve many individuals, some of whom would inevitably perceive the action as illegal or immoral. This would trigger mass resignations, especially among senior military officers. The press would scoop the story immediately, maintaining it as the headline news for weeks. The media coverage would explode, significantly increasing content output about the invasion. Notably, some media outlets were aware of prior secret operations, such as those in Venezuela, but chose not to report them to protect service members. In contrast, an invasion of Greenland would not receive such restraint. For this reason, any credible invasion plans would almost certainly leak well before any actual attack. Second, the economic consequences would be catastrophic. The United States risks plummeting into a recession or even a depression if Europe responds harshly. Trade with Europe could halt overnight, not just cutting the $700 billion in exports, but also disrupting roughly half of global supply chains. Products requiring complex manufacturing would stop or face long delays, making the COVID-19 pandemic supply disruptions pale in comparison. Americans would likely long for the relatively mild inflation seen under the Biden administration, which ironically helped Trump regain political support. Even China might hesitate to support such an aggressive move, despite it fracturing the world's most powerful alliance. The global economy would suffer massive damage, with Europe bearing substantial costs as well, potentially leading to political backlash within European governments. European citizens, frustrated with U.S. actions, could push their governments to maintain tough sanctions, even if it harms their own economies. Sympathy for European protests might arise within the United States itself. Economic sanctions serve as a powerful political tool to exert pressure, and Europe would be motivated to encourage internal dissent in America to reverse such a policy. The economic fallout of invading Greenland would resemble a form of mutually assured destruction, where both sides suffer immense losses, but the status quo is fiercely defended. The crisis would highlight how deeply entwined and fragile global trade and finance truly are. Third, the financial implications would be severe. Europe holds approximately $3.6 trillion in U.S. Treasury securities, about 40% of all foreign holdings. These assets are split between public and private sectors, but a U.S. invasion would likely trigger massive sell-offs. Although Europe would incur losses, the resulting decrease in demand for U.S. debt would cause borrowing costs to skyrocket. This would precipitate a budget crisis in Washington, as Congress would be forced to pay significantly more to service the national debt. European countries would begin dumping dollars from their currency reserves, prompting other nations to follow suit due to diminished confidence in the U.S. dollar. This chain reaction could threaten the dollar's status as the global reserve currency. Fourth, the United States maintains roughly 40 military bases across Europe. In response to an invasion of Greenland, European hosts would quarantine these bases by refusing to allow resupply or reinforcement. The U.S. would be permitted to withdraw its personnel and equipment, but would lose forward positioning in the region. Additional bases in Africa and the Middle East, which depend on logistics support passing through Europe, would also face operational strain. This would severely disrupt American global military capabilities, isolating forces and complicating strategic operations far from home. Fifth, and finally, a constitutional crisis would erupt in Washington, D.C. The Democratic Party would unanimously vote to impeach the president. If this occurred during the 2026 Congress, they might secure the 3 Republican votes necessary to pass the measure easily. In 2027, Democrats would likely proceed without Republican support, possibly gaining some defections from Republicans who no longer back a lame duck president. The Senate trial would be more complicated. Democrats would vote unanimously to convict, but securing the 2/3 majority would require persuading approximately 20 Republicans. In 2027, fewer Republican votes might suffice, but the political tension could escalate if Trump refuses to leave office, plunging the nation into a deeper constitutional crisis. In such a scenario, figures like J.D. Vance might see an opportunity to seize power, calculating that their electoral prospects in 2028 would be damaged by association with the administration. Vance or others might attempt to forcibly remove Trump from the White House, administering the presidential oath of office themselves. Alternatively, enough Republicans might remain loyal and acquit the president. Regardless, any attempt by the United States to annex Greenland would run afoul of constitutional requirements, as expansion of U.S. territory must be authorized by federal law with congressional support. This dilemma would spark yet another form of constitutional crisis, highlighting the legal complexities of territorial acquisition. As for Europe's response, it might choose not to attempt reclaiming Greenland militarily. The European Union functions primarily as a trade bloc. Its de facto military component is NATO, which operates on consensus. The United States would complicate NATO's unity by occupying Greenland, and since there is no mechanism to expel a member, NATO's response would be constrained. Alternatively, Europe could decide to mount a counter-invasion, but the uncertainty about the continent's resolve adds another layer of complexity. In any case, the United States would have effectively lost before any true warfare began. It is worth noting that Greenland, while strategically significant, is not so valuable that the entire enterprise would be worth the ensuing chaos. The scenario is essentially a game of chicken, with Europe holding the structural advantage by favoring the status quo. For the United States under Trump to succeed, it would require pushing the situation beyond the brink. Yet history and logic suggest that Trump is unlikely to have the necessary leverage in such a high-stakes geopolitical confrontation. I do not claim to fully understand Trump's thought processes, so this remains speculative. but the consequences outlined suggest that an invasion would be a reckless gamble. This exercise, though seemingly absurd, serves a deeper purpose. Looking ahead to a decade from now, Greenland's value may increase dramatically due to climate change and melting ice caps, making it a more coveted strategic asset. Imagine that the aggressor is not the United States, but Russia. Russia could amass naval power equivalent to what the US had in the hypothetical scenario and quietly sail toward Greenland. Unlike the US, Russian media controls would prevent leaks, and there would be no qualms about executing the operation. Past Russian tactics in Crimea demonstrate an approach of seizing territory swiftly and presenting others with a fait accompli. In this future scenario, Russian forces would face little resistance taking Greenland. Any civil disobedience in Nuuk might be crushed or suppressed, with half the population disappearing and the remainder coerced into compliance. The West would consider cutting off trade with Russia, but bilateral trade has already diminished dramatically following prior conflicts. Selling off Russian treasury holdings or liquidating ruble reserves would be futile because few Western nations hold such assets. Russia's non-existent European bases would remain unchallenged. Unlike the constitutional turmoil expected in the US, Putin would be celebrated for his strategic triumph, securing a legacy that has eluded him thus far. This thought experiment underscores that if the United States can theoretically invade Greenland with relative ease, so too can other powers. Russia's previous strategy of rapid territorial grabs, followed by international hesitation, could be replicated here. What is intended to deter such aggression, NATO's Article 5, has its limitations. Article 5 works best when allies are already engaged in a common defense, but it becomes difficult to enforce once an aggressor has entrenched itself. Allies might hesitate to commit forces to retake Greenland or launch retaliatory strikes elsewhere, particularly if political will is weak. For Article 5 to serve as an effective deterrent, substantial defensive measures must be established in Greenland immediately. This means far more than the token US and Danish military presence currently stationed there. A robust NATO presence akin to the forces deployed in the Baltic states should be maintained under conditions of duress, with ongoing battles necessitating Allied intervention. Do not wait until Greenland is fully occupied before reacting. Instead, fortify the island now, prepare troops to hold their ground, and ensure allies are ready to provide timely support. This approach would provide a credible deterrent against any future attempts at seizure. In conclusion, while the idea of the United States invading Greenland under Trump's leadership seems outlandish, the scenario exposes important vulnerabilities and strategic realities. The consequences of such an action would be profound, involving economic collapse, military isolation, and political upheaval. More importantly, it highlights the growing geopolitical significance of the Arctic and the urgent need for preemptive defense measures. If the world wishes to avoid a crisis over Greenland, it is imperative to act now rather than react after the fact. Thank you for engaging with this analysis. If you found it insightful, please like, share, and subscribe.